Hello, everybody. We are back for our latest episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, co-founder of Account Aim, the RevOps BI platform. Super excited to welcome Kathryn Castle to the show today. She's the founder of the RevOps agency Candybox. Kathryn, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to the conversation.
Kathryn and I were chatting, and she was talking about how her firm and her conversation with prospects, with customers, is increasingly focused on CPQ. And so we're going to dive into that today. It's going to be a great conversation. But Kathryn, you want to share a bit more about your background and kind of like how you came to found Candybox?
Yeah, for sure. So, if there are any other consultants or agency founders listening, I think my story won't be particularly unique. I started independent consulting around about 7 years ago now. My background is in B2B tech, startups and scale-ups. And so my initial customers were mostly in that demographic. And from them, I would often hear, wow, it's so refreshing to work with a consultant where we don't have to explain all of our acronyms or how we do business. And so I got the idea that maybe there was sort of an underserved gap in the market there. And that's where Candybox came from. So we've always really been focused on the B2B SaaS space and primarily scale ups and mid market companies.
Awesome. Well, let's dive right into CPQ then.
Mhm.
Maybe like just from the jump, um, which businesses actually need CPQ?
That is a very good and potentially loaded question because it can be hard to answer it simply. And I think that's actually one of the main reasons we end up having so many conversations about CPQ because it's a big investment. Generally speaking, CPQ solutions are not cheap, and they require ongoing maintenance. So companies don't want to make a decision like that lightly. Generally speaking, there's like some rules of thumb where you might want to consider that your business needs a CPQ solution. So if your business and your product catalog has inherent complexity, that can be a sign. So I say inherent complexity because sometimes complexity is more a sign of lack of organization
Mm.
than actual complexity. Um, which is a whole nother story, which we can definitely dive into. But if you have, for example, a very large, highly configurable product catalog, if you have a lot of product dependencies that you really need to be enforced, for example, if you're selling A product, then you need B, but if you have C, then you can't have A,
Mm.
that can be a sign. If through your quoting and desk process, you have a lot of different teams touching your systems who need to coordinate, like sales, finance, legal, RevOps, that can also influence the decision. If you're seeing a lot of mistakes during the quoting process that maybe you don't catch until later on and that have a real financial or customer impact, that's something to pay attention to as well. Um, and then some other things to consider, is your deal volume so high that manual quoting is not scalable anymore? Does leadership need consistent data that's truly trustworthy for fast forecasting renewals, rev rec, finance processes, and so on? And also, do you have a way of supporting a CPQ if you do end up making that decision to go ahead?
That's great. A lot of good info in there. I like that you touched on like for who needs CPQ, you gave kind of both like the called firmographic signals of like inherent product complexity and like, but also the symptoms of like when might be the right time too. So if like you're quoting incorrectly or it's taking really long. Because I think there's like the do we need CPQ and then when do we need it? And I think you
Mm,
covered both of those really
yeah.
well. You also made a good point at the end around like, do you have what it takes to support it? What is that? Is that just a dedicated headcount, or how do you think about like ongoing support?
Another good question. So it depends a bit on which tool you go with. There are some CPQ solutions out there now that are relatively lightweight, and as long as your products and your processes are not changing constantly once you've gone through the initial setup, the maintenance can be relatively manageable. And that could be, an internal hire who's doing it part time. It could be, somebody within the org who has a different, official day job and just does a bit of CPQ maintenance as needed. It could be, a part-time consultant or an agency like ourselves. But, it can scale up from there. We work with companies and, I've also worked in-house at companies in the past where you will have one or even more dedicated people whose full-time job
Yeah.
is managing CPQ and potentially billing systems as well. So it's one of those your mileage will vary type questions.
For sure. You made a comment around kind of like CPQ Lite. I know that Candybox actually does like a good amount of this. So I do want to talk about like the vendor landscape and how folks can think about their options. But it sounds like, for many folks, maybe it's their um, maturity of company and just like how old they are as a business, or even just like their inherent product complexity or lack thereof. Like some folks won't actually need a CPQ tool. And so walk me through like CPQ Lite, as you call it. Like how can folks kind of run CPQ in Salesforce natively?
hmm Yeah, yeah. I think this is really interesting because a lot of companies, they get to a certain stage where they're having some of these symptoms that we touched on earlier. They jump to the conclusion we need to buy a CPQ product. They don't realize, particularly if they're using Salesforce, that there's a lot that you can build out of the box without implementing a lot of technical debt that won't necessarily scale. So when we talk about CPQ Lite, for us, that's kind of a service that we've developed over many years and many different engagements. And it's geared towards, again, B2B SaaS companies who are not really ready for a full-fledged CPQ for whatever reason, but they do need core CPQ functionality. So it addresses a lot of things that you don't get in Salesforce out of the box and which are difficult to build, but are actually possible to build very cleanly and will set you up to move on to a CPQ tool if you need to in the future. So it addresses things like partial quoting terms, like if you need to start billing partway through a month and you need to do those partial calculations,
Mm.
ramp deals where you have different pricing through different terms of the contract, multi-year deals, amendments, so upsells, downsells, making sure all of that gets reconciled correctly. And it also bundles that into a relatively clean and user-friendly quoting experience. So your reps aren't, struggling to try and figure out how to even get a quote ready for a customer.
Got it. That's super interesting. It sounds really helpful. I thinking through all of those complex examples that you just gave. That even folks sometimes in accounting are trying to create crazy logic to figure those
Yeah,
things out, and it's always
it's
a
not
challenge.
easy. It is not easy.
So walk me through like CPQ Lite. Like I fully understand like how CPQ works with like a third party vendor that's kind of plugged in from quote to cash. Walk me through with like CPQ Lite, basically like the higher level steps. Like how are folks using Salesforce just to drive this? 'Cause I think what you described is a lot of like, in the calculation and the contracting. But is there any more from like a workflow perspective, or yeah, just walk me through like the process kind of front to back at the highest level if you
Yeah.
can.
So when you say that, you mean sort of how is it structured, or what what's the experience like for the reps who are using Salesforce?
Yeah, yeah, maybe what like CPQ Lite means to you, from like where does it start and where does it end, and what are just kind of like the key steps.
Yeah, usually it starts, and again, I'm talking about a specific Salesforce solution here, so that's why I'm
Yeah.
going to reference Salesforce as opposed to other CRMs. And it starts early on in the opportunity process. So you've got an opportunity. You need to create a quote for a customer. So let's start and the new business run. It's a net new customer. You want to be able to quickly and easily configure a quote that you can send out to a customer and know that the pricing is correct. You don't want to, as a rep, have to do loads of manual calculations that may or may not be correct. So it's like kind of like a pop-up, step-by-step walkthrough. You go through, you select your products, you select the number of seats or the usage model that you need. You select the key contractual information like start date, end date, billing information. And once you put that in, it just generates the quote for you. And it does all of that using out-of-the-box Salesforce objects, which is one of the things that is useful if you then want to move to another tool at some point, because you're not trying to deal with a lot of customization that you've created. It allows you to create a quote PDF that you can then send out through e-signature. And when the opportunity hopefully gets to close one and you've closed your new customer, and there's a lot of logic happening behind the scenes that creates your renewal opportunity. It creates a contract to represent what the customer's actual, active products and pricing look like. If you create an upsell at any point, it will modify the contract, it will modify the renewals so that you don't have things like a renewal that was originally correct when the opportunity first closed, but then, 2 months later after the upsell, it's no longer correct. And then that kind of repeats itself, throughout the customer life cycle as you go and you close more renewals and upsells and so on and so forth.
And you call it the CPQ Lite. That sounds
I
complex to
know.
me, which I guess is why you have the offering and all the business in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I won't lie, it took us a long time to develop it, but now that it's actually developed, it's very quick and easy to deliver, just kind of out of the box. And I think I'm obviously biased here, but I think it's what a lot of growing SaaS businesses really would wish for in terms of like the quote to cash life cycle in Salesforce, but you don't get that out of the box, unfortunately.
Yeah. Just to round that out, that's super helpful walkthrough. And maybe this is a stupid question, but so which objects are you actually using in CPQ Lite? So obviously
Like,
opportunity. Obviously you're
yeah.
using flow, which is not an object, but to keep things updated. Like what else
Mhm.
goes into this?
So hopefully I'm not going to miss any here, but I'm pretty sure it's opportunity, the quote object, you know, products, price books, the contract object to kind of like store, what the customer is actually paying for and what their actual contract looks like at any given time. Um, And I think assets as well, but to be honest with you, I would need to go back and double check that with my technical team. But
Uh,
it's
That sounds
really,
pretty.
yeah, it's I think it sounds complicated because to understand how everything should be set up in a way that's scalable, like that is quite complex. But once it's done, I think there is a relative simplicity to it. So I suppose that's more where the CPQ Lite name comes from.
Yeah, for sure. And don't get me wrong, it does sound like a great solution. I recognize there's a lot on the kind of the under the hood that you guys have done, which is really cool. Tell me about your perspective on kind of like Revenue Cloud and the end of Salesforce CPQ. Like I want to get to like the rest of the vendor landscape,
Yeah.
but like what are you hearing from folks? Are people moving to
Mhm.
CPQ Lite? Are they, having to
Mhm.
migrate to other solutions? Like what's your kind of perspective on the industry
Yeah.
shift here with this change?
Yeah, I think so. My answer is definitely going to be informed by the fact that we're working with customers in a certain demographic and, company size. So, like I said, they're mostly smaller to mid-market, some small enterprise. I would say, generally speaking, Revenue Cloud is overkill for customers like that. It's complex. To answer it shortly, it is complex, and the architecture is not that similar to how Salesforce CPQ is architected. So even if you have somebody internally who's been supporting Salesforce CPQ up till now, they will have to relearn Revenue Cloud from the ground up.
So
Um,
frustrating if you're using Salesforce for
yeah,
that.
I mean, it's a lot of people like that. I think, you'll encounter a lot of people who are Salesforce admins or developers or consultants, and they kind of relish the chance to learn a new product. But, logistically, it does add complexity and time. And especially when there's a newer product, which I would say that Revenue Cloud still is, there's not always a lot of resources out there. So
Mhm.
that can make the learning process harder. But on top of that, it also has a relatively high price tag because it's a very sophisticated product. And so that means for the companies we work with, it's usually not the logical fit. But that doesn't mean that for other companies, like particularly larger enterprises, that it wouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, it's a good segue. Kind of give me like your lay of the land of like the CPQ vendor landscape. I don't know if you have like a mental model or if you are kind of like bucketing some of the most popular vendors into certain categories. Like how do you think about like the various options out there?
Yeah. There, I would say compared to when CPQ, Salesforce CPQ or SteelBrick was first becoming a real thing, there's so much more choice than there used to be, which on the one hand is great. It means that there's a lot of options to choose from. You have CPQs that are really tailored to certain industries, company sizes, selling motions, and whatnot. But I think it can be a bit overwhelming for potential buyers. And they're like, how do I figure out what I need? I don't want something that's too simple and will outgrow it, but I also don't want something that's overkill. So and like on the more simplistic side, you have solutions that maybe they take the form of third-party apps that can integrate with Salesforce or HubSpot. Some of them are Salesforce-native, which means that they're just like built within Salesforce essentially, and you don't need to do any kind of integration, which can be great for some companies. Um, they're often, but not always, a little cheaper. And they kind of have a discrete set of features that are just meant to address certain core use cases. So they may not be as configurable as some other solutions, but they're usually a bit more like user friendly and
Hmm.
easier to set up.
Kind of plug and play.
Yeah, plug and play. Yeah, I mean, I think it's rare to find a CPQ solution that's like genuinely
Fair.
plug and play because even simple ones are still complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a fair way of describing it. And then you do have more sort of sophisticated more sophisticated options. They will often provide a lot of integration capabilities. There's more configurability. Um, they will often allow simple use cases to be quite plug and play, like you mentioned, but when companies start to grow in terms of complexity or size, they will allow for additional configurability to match like your unique business model. And then you start getting, to the upper end of the market, which is like the revenue clouds of the world. Um, I'm less familiar here, but these are often like full revenue management platforms. Like you'll often see these types of platforms not necessarily marketed just to CPQ, but full like end-to-end billing platforms as well.
How do you think someone should, if they're, RevOps leader at a growing company, think about which of those options is right for them? Like we talked a little bit in the beginning around like who is CPQ right for, some of the symptoms. So I think we covered that a good amount, but I guess I'm kind of trying to land more on like, should we go for a CPQ tool that fits us today versus tomorrow? Like how would you guide folks on that kind of choice and how they can kind of self-identify there?
Yeah. So I think something that not every company is aware of when they start to think we need CPQ is how many of their symptoms are due to needing a new piece of technology and how many are due to things like technical debt or lack of process or just, disorganization.
Mhm.
And that can be it can be hard for somebody to identify, which is which. So that's something I would always encourage people to examine. Are we having problems because we genuinely have, a complex product catalog? Um, we really need to be able to support these complex business motions? Or is some of the pain coming from the fact that we don't really know what our product structure should look like, or our pricing guardrails, or, we're doing our approvals in Slack and
Hmm.
it's really hard to keep track of that. So I know that's not exactly the question that you asked, but I genuinely think that's a really good place to start, because if you do identify that some of the issues you're having are due to poor data quality, poor CRM hygiene, lack of process, you can start by addressing some of those issues. And whether or not you end up going with a CPQ solution, you will already be in a better position. Um,
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what I wanted to ask you next too, is what
mm,
can folks do to be ready for a CPQ implementation? So I think you might have just covered it. It sounds like make sure your data is high quality. Sounds like you should have like a product and price book. You should have some guardrails and process around
mm.
pricing. Are those the main things? Is there anything else folks should be like getting squared away before they evaluate which vendor might be right for them?
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely what we just covered. So trying to get your basics as stable as possible, because you're going to need to do that anyway when you do your implementation. So it's things like, as much as possible, cleaning up your product catalog, your pricing logic, defining your approval processes, understanding what you want your data model to look like. Um, and then I think I touched on it a bit, but data hygiene, um, that will often end up being fairly manual, no matter how you try and square it away. It can involve things like checking every single customer contract for accuracy, because
Ouch.
you need to know that the data that you're building everything around is correct. Backfilling missing records, going through and like cleaning up your renewals and your upsells, because if the foundation is poor, if the data quality is just not there, then you will be building upon a poor foundation, and the problems will just continue to repeat themselves even if you set up your CPQ correctly. Um, I think the only other thing that I might add is I think companies should have a plan for the ongoing maintenance. Um, Occasionally, I think that most companies do realize these days that CPQ is not a set and like a get it and what's it called? Set it and forget it. That's what I was looking for. A set it and forget it type tool. Um, but I think it's worth reiterating, like, you need to know who's going to be owning CPQ and supporting it long term, whether that's an internal hire, somebody fractional, consulting partner, whatever you choose.
Got it. Yeah, that's super helpful. Is there any advice you have, or maybe common pitfalls you see around the product and price book? Like, it sounds simple to me. So, is it just a matter of making sure the latest and greatest is updated, or what am I missing there? Anything?
Hmm. I'm not sure if there's anything specific that comes to mind, because every company is different.
Yeah.
Um, but I suppose you might see, the only thing that's coming to mind for me right now is sometimes you'll see things that just aren't really necessarily, like having a different product for every single permutation of how it's
Mm.
sold, as opposed to building your quote to cash motion to support that. So instead of having like, um, one platform product, software platform product, you have software platform product US dollars, software
Mm.
platform product euros, software platform product annual, and then one for monthly, and then you end up with
10
all of
seats, 11 seats, 12 seats.
yeah, essentially, and that's not always necessary. So yeah, like there's it's probably a lot of examples I could give here, but you usually have to look at it on a case by case basis.
Makes sense. Catherine, sadly, we're at time. Time flew on this one. Anything I should have asked and didn't, or anything I missed, or you want to kind of wrap up with on CBQ, or did we
Mm,
cover it all?
I think we covered a lot. I think really the main thing I want to communicate here is if you're encountering some of the issues that I've mentioned on this call, try not to think of CPQ as a magic bullet and evaluate them from a more neutral perspective, because CPQ will enforce whatever you have in place. And if those are bad processes and bad data, then you may end up in a worse situation than where you started.
Yeah, I think there's a parallel across a bunch of things beyond CPQ as well.
Absolutely.
AI, any RevOps process, we
Oh,
see it all the
so
time.
true.
So
So true.
great advice. Kathryn, thanks so much for joining us today. This was fun.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.